Welcome to History in the Shadow. Today, we uncover the fascinating and tragic story of Queen Mary of Scotland, a woman whose life was marked by beauty, power, and heartbreak. If you enjoyed discovering hidden stories from history, please subscribe. Your one like means everything to us. Welcome to History in the Shadow, where we reveal shocking and forgotten tales from the past. Don't forget to subscribe. Your support helps us bring these stories to life. Our story begins in Scotland, where young Queen Mary stands with Lord James, preparing to lead her army north to confront rebellion. Mary's authority is tested immediately. She orders the execution of a rebellious governor, showing she will not tolerate defiance. Meanwhile, a French scholar named Chatelard arrives at court, his eyes filled with admiration for the young queen. Chatelard's infatuation grows dangerous. One night, he enters Mary's private chamber uninvited, shocking her attendants. Mary confronts him directly. His inappropriate behavior cannot be ignored, despite his pleas for mercy. News of Chatelard's foolishness reaches Queen Elizabeth in England, who watches Scottish affairs with keen political interest. Elizabeth studies every move Mary makes, calculating how Scotland's queen might threaten England's security. In England, Lady Lennox presents her son, Lord Darnley, as a potential suitor for Mary, hoping to unite their royal bloodlines. Mary faces pressure from all sides regarding marriage. Every European prince seems interested, but political complications surround each option. Elizabeth meets with Melville, Mary's diplomatic messenger, engaging in careful political maneuvering about the Scottish queen's future. In the palace gardens, Melville presents Mary's letter to Elizabeth, who reads it with calculating eyes. Elizabeth questions Melville intensely about Mary's qualities, comparing the two queens in beauty, skill, and virtue. Elizabeth bestows honors upon Lord Darnley, though her true intentions remain hidden beneath courtly ceremony. She speaks with Melville about Darnley, carefully testing whether he might be suitable for Mary. Finally, Elizabeth grants Darnley permission to travel to Scotland, setting in motion events that will change Mary's life forever. Darnley arrives at Wemyss Castle and kneels before Queen Mary. Their first meeting is marked by formal courtesy and mutual curiosity. When Mary visits the seaside, crowds gather to see their queen. Darnley stands among them, his tall figure catching her attention. Mary begins to consider Darnley seriously as a husband. He is young, handsome, and carries royal blood from both Scottish and English lines. Darnley offers Mary a ring, but she hesitates, aware that marriage is as much about politics as love. Mary faces opposition from her nobles, who distrust Darnley's ambitions and his family's connections to England. Lord James and other rebellious nobles gather at Stirling Castle, threatening Mary's authority if she proceeds with the marriage. Despite all warnings, Mary follows her heart. She walks down the aisle of Holyrood Chapel to marry Lord Darnley. The wedding ceremony is blessed by a Catholic priest, a decision that further alienates Mary from Protestant England. But happiness proves short-lived. Darnley's true character soon emerges. Pride and vanity consume him as he demands more power. Mary leads her forces to victory against the rebellious nobles, proving her strength as both queen and military commander. Foreign ambassadors watch nervously as tensions rise between Mary and Elizabeth over religious and political differences. At Holyrood House, Mary's marriage deteriorates. Darnley grows cold and distant, resentful of his wife's superior intelligence. A new figure enters Mary's court, David Rizzio, an Italian musician and secretary whose talent quickly earns the queen's trust. Rizzio works diligently in the royal study, impressing everyone with his diplomatic skills and loyalty. He becomes Mary's chief advisor on foreign correspondence, handling sensitive political negotiations with European powers. Mary increasingly relies on Rizzio's counsel, finding in him the intelligent companionship her husband fails to provide. Court attendants notice the Queen's growing trust in Rizzio, whispering about their frequent private conferences. From a balcony, Mary watches Darnley walk alone through the courtyard, the distance between them now impossible to bridge. Rizzio and Mary work late into the night, reviewing letters and making decisions that shape Scotland's foreign policy. In peaceful moments, they walk through the royal gardens, discussing art, music, and the complexities of ruling a divided nation. Darnley watches from a distance, his jealousy growing darker each day as he sees Mary's respect for Rizzio. Alone with his wine, Darnley broods over imagined insults, his mind poisoned by courtiers who whisper accusations about Rizzio. Darnley meets secretly with Lord Ruthven, a fierce nobleman who shares his hatred of the Italian secretary. Ruthven and Morton plot together, planning to murder Rizzio and force Mary to grant Darnley the power he craves. Darnley joins the conspiracy fully, agreeing to help the nobles enter Mary's private chambers to seize Rizzio. Unaware of the danger, Mary spends a quiet evening with Rizzio, who plays music to soothe her during her pregnancy. Rizzio reads diplomatic correspondence to Mary, their easy friendship a stark contrast to her troubled marriage. Outside the chamber, Mary's attendants sense something wrong as strange sounds echo through the palace corridors. In a dark room, the conspirators finalize their plan, studying maps of Holyrood and timing their attack for maximum surprise. Ruthven leads armed men up the stone staircase toward Mary's private chambers, their footsteps masked by the night. Suddenly, the door bursts open. Men rush in as Mary and Rizzio sit at supper. Terror fills the room. Darnley blocks Mary's path as she tries to protect Rizzio. Armed men surround them, and Morton declares their intentions. After the murder, Mary sits alone, traumatized and imprisoned in her own palace while Darnley assumes control. At dawn, Melville manages to reach the courtyard, determined to help his queen escape her captors. Melville reaches the town provost, urgently requesting aid to rescue Mary from the conspirators' control. Mary pretends to reconcile with Darnley, using cunning and persuasion to gain freedom of movement. She escapes to Edinburgh, where loyal subjects rally to her cause, their support overwhelming the rebels. The Earl of Bothwell, a powerful Scottish nobleman, prepares to leave Scotland temporarily to avoid political enemies. From a windswept cliff overlooking the German Ocean, Bothwell surveys the harsh landscape of his temporary exile. Back in Scotland, Mary gives birth to a son. The future King James is presented to the court as cannons announce his arrival. As autumn arrives, Mary's fears grow. Darnley has become dangerous and unpredictable, moving between castles without explanation. Darnley writes secret letters, plotting against his own wife in desperate attempts to regain power and influence. Mary's advisors quietly discuss a dire question: should she divorce Darnley for her own safety and Scotland's stability? At Stirling Castle, the baptism of Prince James becomes a grand celebration, with English nobles bringing lavish gifts. Mary rides through the Scottish countryside to visit her wounded lieutenant, unaware of gathering storms ahead. Bothwell stands before a mirror, preparing himself as his neglected wife watches sadly from behind. Bothwell addresses nobles in the grand chamber, his commanding presence impossible to ignore as Mary listens carefully. In private negotiations, Bothwell leans toward Morton, discussing matters of state with Mary's portrait between them. Mary visits Darnley's sickbed. Despite everything, she still holds his hand, showing mercy to her failing husband. Mary leaves the townhouse where Darnley recovers, carrying remedies as servants watch anxiously. Servants prepare a bath in the stone kitchen while Bothwell watches from shadows, mysterious plans forming. Mary stands in a corridor as French Paris, a young servant, enters her service, clutching keys nervously. In the garden, a groom holds horses while men load heavy bags of gunpowder near Darnley's residence. The men struggle with additional gunpowder as evening falls, trying to maneuver a massive cask through narrow doorways. Inside Darnley's chamber, Mary rises affectionately from his bedside as Bothwell waits at the door. Mary pauses in the hallway, noticing a servant carrying a satchel that smells strangely of gunpowder. At a wedding celebration, French Paris stands apart, his worry deepening as Bothwell approaches with intense purpose. Bothwell confronts French Paris at the palace entrance, his intimidating presence forcing the frightened servant's cooperation. By moonlight, Bothwell and French Paris slip through a broken wall, unlocking doors and moving past sleeping watchmen. In a moonlit garden, Bothwell and his companions wait tensely for news, anxiety building in the cold night air. Suddenly, a massive explosion lights the night sky. The house erupts in flames and thunder as men prepare to flee. Bothwell rushes back to Holyrood, halted by a sentinel who demands explanation for his late-night return. Bothwell feigns shock and horror when news arrives of Darnley's death, though nobles exchange suspicious glances. Anonymous placards appear throughout Edinburgh, publicly accusing Bothwell of murder as Lennox demands justice. Mary sits among nobles as Bothwell boldly discusses marriage, while Lennox watches with grief-driven suspicion. Mary rides through the countryside with Melville when Bothwell appears with 500 armed men. At Dunbar Castle, Bothwell speaks intensely to Mary in private, pressing his case for marriage. Bothwell presents a parchment signed by leading nobles, arguing that marriage to him is Mary's best option. Mary appears weary and resigned, lowering her gaze as Bothwell watches with triumph in the candlelit chamber. In a small stone chapel, Mary and Bothwell stand together during a quiet, private wedding ceremony. Mary rides toward Edinburgh beside Bothwell, smiling lightly at cheering townspeople under morning sunlight. At Holyrood Chapel's gate, Mary pauses respectfully with a silver key as townspeople bow before their queen. From a balcony, Mary and Bothwell stand together as crowds cheer below, drums echoing through the streets. Morton holds private council with Melville, discussing the dangerous situation created by Mary's marriage to Bothwell. Scottish nobles gather in a dim council hall, Morton pointing to Bothwell's name written on an accusation scroll. The Duke of Hamilton studies a sealed letter, whispering with fellow lords about rising concerns regarding Bothwell. Laird of Grange rides swiftly across foggy lochshores, carrying urgent news as dawn breaks over the hills. Mary walks through dim hallways with Bothwell, their shadows stretching long as servants watch fearfully. Mary sits beside a narrow window as thin sunlight illuminates her troubled face, Bothwell standing behind. In a storm-swept courtyard, soldiers gather as Bothwell gives sharp orders while Mary watches from above. The elderly French ambassador Lecroc bows before Mary inside a richly furnished chamber as diplomatic pressure mounts. Mary prays alone in a candlelit chapel, her hands trembling as Bothwell watches silently from the doorway. Lady Douglas speaks urgently to Lord James Douglas in a council chamber, whispering Bothwell's name repeatedly. Mary rides through a rocky pass surrounded by watchmen, Bothwell close at her side under grey skies. Mary arrives at Edinburgh's gates as crowds of townspeople gather around her procession under flickering torchlight. Mary walks slowly through a long corridor as attendants follow, Bothwell waiting at the far end in dim light. Inside a solemn chamber, Mary meets with Lecroc as Bothwell stands stiffly behind, diplomatic tensions rising. Mary arrives at Stirling Castle, riding up the steep ramp as massive gates open and watchmen salute. In the royal nursery, Mary lifts her infant son as soldiers stand guard and Bothwell watches quietly. Mary rides through a narrow valley surrounded by snow-covered hills, Bothwell leading armed soldiers toward Perth. At Craigmilla's gate, Mary pauses as Melville approaches with urgent news while Bothwell stands nearby. On a hillside overlooking a river, Mary meets with Grange as Bothwell stands opposite, soldiers watching tensely. Mary rides across a quiet meadow beside Bothwell, breathing cool morning air as their small escort follows. In a dim chamber, Mary stands before a window overlooking Edinburgh as Bothwell enters quietly behind her. At a council table, Morton speaks sharply while pointing at Bothwell's name on a proclamation as lords approve. In a palace gallery, Mary listens as Melville warns about rising noble opposition, while Bothwell stands silent. Mary stands in a library holding letters from different nobles as Bothwell reads over her shoulder. Grange rides through a muddy village carrying a sealed message for Mary as anxious villagers watch. Mary meets secretly with the Duke of Hamilton as his lords stand behind while Bothwell watches defensively. In a candlelit crypt, Ruthven and Lindsay review a map plotting Bothwell's downfall as torches crackle. Mary looks over a peaceful lake as Bothwell holds her horse's reins, discussing their uncertain future. At a lonely hillside, soldiers stand ready as Bothwell mounts his horse while Mary watches beneath storm clouds. Mary kneels alone in her chamber, praying for peace as candles flicker and whispers of rebellion grow louder. Mary walks between lines of soldiers, preparing to face rebellious nobles as Bothwell approaches on horseback. Melville stands alone beside a fireplace, holding documents carefully as he prepares to meet Mary. Inside a quiet throne room, Melville explains Scotland's troubled state to Mary, who listens with exhausted dignity. A single candle flickers as Mary sits rigidly at a table, haunted by memories as Lindsay and Ruthven stand accusingly. In a candlelit chamber, Mary signs the abdication document with visible reluctance as Lindsay and Melville solemnly accept. Inside the solemn chapel, Scottish nobles lift the crown and scepter as Mary's infant son is proclaimed king. In Lochleven Castle's dim corridor, Mary walks slowly with heavy footsteps echoing as watchmen escort her. In a cold tower room, Mary stands at the barred window as dawn reveals Melville entering with news. Lindsay confronts Mary in the great hall, delivering the rebels' demands with cold finality as candles flicker violently. In a cramped chamber, Mary kneels in prayer as Melville stands guard-like behind her. Across the courtyard, Scottish nobles gather around a sealed document as Mary watches from a narrow doorway. A cold breeze moves through the passage as Mary is escorted toward the courtyard, Melville offering quiet reassurance. Lindsay reads aloud the noble's latest demands as Mary stands across from him, her face heavy with despair. In a cold tower chamber, Mary sits by the barred window as Melville reads a quiet prayer. In the moonlit courtyard, Scottish nobles gather in a tight circle as Mary watches from a doorway. By a dying lantern's glow, Mary signs another document with trembling fingers as Lindsay and Melville watch. Faint dawn light enters the tower as Mary rises from her mattress, Melville entering with a folded parchment. Inside the cold chapel, Mary kneels before the altar as Lindsay watches without sympathy. In the castle courtyard, Melville walks beside Mary under cold morning haze as watchmen escort them. Inside the strategy room, Scottish nobles argue over documents as Mary appears at the doorway silently. By the barred window, Mary watches the loch waters below as Melville speaks quietly behind her. Cold rain taps against the window as Mary stands shivering, Melville delivering news of growing unrest. Lindsay slams the decree onto the table as Mary watches silently, torchlight splitting across her face. Mary kneels on the icy floor as Melville whispers a desperate prayer for her deliverance. Outside the tower, nobles gather beneath a dripping archway as Mary watches from above. Mary signs a final declaration with strained movements as Lindsay watches and Melville lowers his gaze. Gray morning light barely reaches the floor as Mary sits quietly in her cell, Melville bringing water. In the council hall, Lindsay declares Mary's authority officially dissolved as she listens from the shadows. A cold wind rattles the tower door as Mary tries to steady herself, Melville worried she may collapse. In the courtyard below, nobles gather around a chest of documents as Mary watches from her window. In a lantern-lit chamber, Mary sits at a narrow table as Melville kneels beside her, promising loyalty. In desperation, Mary escapes Lochleven and flees to England, seeking protection from her cousin Queen Elizabeth. Mary arrives at an English castle, confident despite her circumstances, ready to present her case to Elizabeth. Inside a dim hall, Elizabeth stands rigid and authoritative, debating what to do with her Scottish cousin. Mary sits in despair as Elizabeth's envoy delivers yet another restriction, her hopes slowly fading. A dim courtroom fills with tension as Mary defends herself while Murray presents the infamous letters against her. In a cold chamber, Mary reads Elizabeth's latest refusal, declaring she would rather die than surrender her honor. Queen Elizabeth paces before her fireplace, weighing the decision to keep Mary captive to protect her throne. Scottish prisoners stand bound in a silent line as Regent Murray passes judgment, while Hamilton's wife watches helplessly. Under moonlight on Linlithgow Street, Hamilton stands on a balcony gripping his firearm, planning vengeance against Murray. Hamilton positions himself near the barricaded door, a horse waiting outside as he prepares his fatal shot. Through the chaotic moonlit street, Murray pushes through the crowd as Hamilton lifts his firearm behind black cloth. Armed townsmen hammer against the barricaded door as Hamilton escapes on horseback, disappearing into darkness. The Duke of Norfolk stands in golden afternoon light, knowing his schemes for Mary have led him toward ruin. Mary sits in a stone chamber, denying accusations of treason with quiet firmness as attendants watch with concern. Mary sits beside a window staring at distant hills, Jane Kennedy's hand steady on her shoulder. Mary sits tensely as a messenger whispers news of possible deliverance, clutching hope of escape. Anthony Babington speaks urgently to noble conspirators, discussing a plan to free Mary from Elizabeth's grasp. Mary listens in shock as officers report the discovery of the secret correspondence, realizing the conspirators are exposed. King James sits at his desk with cold indifference, offering neither comfort nor support to his imprisoned mother. Mary stands gazing toward Fotheringay Castle, reflecting on a life spent securing her son's rights. Inside Fotheringay's great hall, lawyers and commissioners gather as Mary is escorted in for her trial. Golden candlelight sweeps across the hall as stories of Mary's beauty and sorrows circulate among courtiers. All eyes turn toward the vacant throne, a symbol of Elizabeth's sovereignty, as Mary refuses to acknowledge the court's authority. The panel of judges sits in grave silence while Mary is warned that the trial will proceed regardless. Mary waits below the central table as the trial's voices echo around her, shadows underlining her fate. Queen Elizabeth sits upon her throne, holding the document condemning Mary, hesitating under the weight of this decision. In her study, Elizabeth lifts the execution warrant, her hand trembling as candlelight flickers across her conflicted expression. Mary sits at a desk composing a final plea to Elizabeth, candlelight illuminating her Bible and golden locket. Elizabeth finally presses her signature onto the warrant as distant hoofbeats echo, commissioners arriving for their mission. In a grand chamber, Mary rises gracefully as commissioners stand bareheaded, unaware they carry news of her execution. Mary listens quietly as the warrant is read aloud, her hand resting gently on her Catholic testament. Rising with controlled fire, Mary responds passionately to questions about her oath and her son's safety. Startled by the announcement of the early execution hour, shock ripples through Mary's composed demeanor. Kneeling on crimson carpet, Mary rejects the Protestant clergyman offered to her, choosing to pray alone in her faith. As supper is prepared, Mary gathers her attendants close, offering wine with tenderness and forgiveness. Mary sits at her desk writing final letters, asking forgiveness for any wrong she may have done. Morning light fills the chamber, as Mary speaks of her final wishes among gathered friends and servants. In the dim great hall, a raised scaffold covered in black cloth stands prepared for the final act. On the black-draped scaffold, 2 executioners stand beside the block as commissioners and guards watch in silence. Kneeling in devotion, Mary finishes her final prayers, requesting a moment's delay to conclude her communion with God. Mary kneels on a crimson cushion giving final instructions as Sir Andrew Melville kisses her hand with deep reverence. Commissioners object to Mary's wish to bring 6 attendants, fearing their grief will disturb the proceedings. The sad procession begins. Mary walks slowly in full court dress, leaning on her physician for support. Mary sits upon the platform as the Dean of Peterborough attempts to persuade her to renounce Catholicism. Mary interrupts the Dean firmly, declaring that she was born and will die a Catholic, her faith unshakable. Mary kneels and lowers her head onto the wooden block, her fingers still holding the ivory crucifix. Inside a silent cathedral, Mary's body rests upon a velvet catafalque adorned with white flowers as mourners bow their heads. In the throne room, Queen Elizabeth sits rigidly, pronouncing punishment on the officer who honored Mary's final request. On a grand balcony, King James looks toward London preparing to depart for England, fulfilling his mother's deepest wish. Inside Westminster Abbey, Mary's remains rest at last among England's royal dead as James gazes upon his mother's final resting place. Thank you for watching our content. We hope you enjoyed discovering Mary, Queen of Scots' remarkable story. Please subscribe and follow us. Your one like truly means everything to us and keeps these historical stories alive. From all of us at History in the Shadow, goodbye, and we'll see you in the next chapter of history.